fast asleep.
Welcome to Fast Asleep with Gina Marie. Hi, everybody. I am Gina, and welcome to episode number 300. I hope your day is going well or went well. You already made a great choice by joining me for a classic story. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to Fast Asleep, please do. Thank you. If you know this podcast, you know how we treasure the short stories of Graham Greene. Nope, not the wonderful Indigenous actor Graham Greene, but the English writer and journalist who spent 67 years about gathering literary acclaim for both his serious Catholic novels and, on the opposite side, what he called his entertainments. Those are his thriller short stories that really are meant to be savored, and that's what we do here. My very favorite of his short stories is The Basement Room. It is on Fast Asleep, episode 239, I believe. Yeah. Now, maybe being the fourth of 6 children from parents who were first cousins. Oh, and his mother was also cousin to Robert Louis Stevenson. All that might explain Mr. Greene's eccentricities. He was bullied in school, and he made several attempts at suicide, sadly. At age 16, in 1920, his family insisted on psychoanalysis for him. That was a pretty radical move for then, don't you think? He went on to study history at Oxford, but he still suffered from depression. He managed to get a volume of poems published, although it really wasn't well received. His first novel was published in 1929. His fourth novel was his first true success, and so much so, it was even adapted for the film Orient Express, made in 1934. You know, many of his films have been made into movies. Many of his works have been made into movies. You might remember The Quiet American. Well, it was first made in 1958, so you don't remember that one, I'm sure, but it was remade in 2002, and Michael Caine earned an Academy Award nomination for his role in it. Greene is quoted as saying, "If anybody ever tries to write a biography of me, how complicated they are going to find it. Oh, and how misled they are going to be." Well, he has been called many things. A devout Catholic, okay. A pulpy hack. That can't be good. A delirious romantic, a bitter cynic, a self-destructor. Oh, here's my favorite. A lifelong adulterer. Oof, he was busy. Yeah, well, I guess it is very complicated if you are trying to understand this very complicated man. I think it's important to know about him, though, that he was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize in Literature several times. No, he didn't win it, but he won numerous other important awards. Today's story, as should be expected, is a bit twisted. Published in 1937, tuck in, everybody, for Graham Greene's Across the Bridge. They say he's worth $1 million, Lucia said. He sat there in the little, hot, damp Mexican square, a dog at his feet, with an air of immense and forlorn patience. The dog attracted your attention at once, for it was very nearly an English setter. Only something had gone wrong with the tail and the feathering. Palms wilted over his head. It was all shade and stuffiness. Round the bandstand, radios talked loudly in Spanish from the little wooden sheds where they changed your pesos into dollars at a loss. I could tell he didn't understand a word from the way he read his newspaper, as I did myself, picking out the words which were like English ones. "He's been here a month," Lucia said. "They turned him out of Guatemala and Honduras." You couldn't keep any secrets for 5 hours in this border town. Lucia had only been 24 hours in the place, but she knew all about Mr. Joseph Calloway. The only reason I didn't know about him, and I'd been in the place 2 weeks, was because I couldn't talk the language any more than Mr. Calloway could. There wasn't another soul in the place who didn't know the story, the whole story, of the Halling Investment Trust and the proceedings for extradition. Any man doing dusty business in any of the wooden booths in the town is better fitted by long observation to tell Mr. Calloway's tale than I am, except that I was in, literally, at the finish. They all watched the drama proceed with immense interest, sympathy, and respect. For, well, after all, he had $1 million. Every once in a while, through the long, steamy day, a boy came and cleaned Mr. Calloway's shoes. Well, he hadn't the right words to resist them. They pretended not to know his English. Oh, he must have had his shoes cleaned the day Lucia and I watched him at least 6 times. Well, at midday, he took a stroll across the square to the Antonio bar, had a bottle of beer, the setter sticking to heel as if they were out for a country walk in England. Well, he had, you may remember, one of the biggest estates in Norfolk. After his bottle of beer, he would walk down between the money changers' huts to the Rio Grande and look across the bridge into the United States. People came and went constantly in cars. Then back to the square till lunchtime. He was staying in the best hotel. But you don't get good hotels in this border town. Nobody stays in them more than a night. The good hotels were on the other side of the bridge. You could see their electric signs 20 stories high from the little square at night, like lighthouses marking the United States. You may ask what I'd been doing in so drab a spot for a fortnight. There was no interest in the place for anyone. It was just damp and dust and poverty, a kind of shabby replica of the town across the river. Both had squares in the same spots. Both had the same number of cinemas. One was cleaner than the other, but that was all. Oh, and more expensive, much more expensive. I'd stayed across there a couple of nights, waiting for a man a tourist bureau said was driving down from Detroit to Yucatan and would sell a place in his car for some fantastically small figure. $20, I think it was. I don't know if he existed or was just invented by the optimist in the agency. Anyway, he never turned up, and so I waited, not much caring, on the cheap side of the river. It didn't much matter. I was living. One day I meant to give up the man from Detroit and go home or go south, but it was easier not to decide anything in a hurry. Lucia was just waiting for a car going the other way, but she didn't have to wait so long. We waited together and watched Mr. Calloway, waiting for God knows what. I don't know how to treat this story. It was a tragedy for Mr. Calloway. It was poetic retribution, I suppose. In the eyes of the shareholders he'd ruined with his bogus transactions. And to Lucia and me, at this stage, it was pure comedy, except when he kicked the dog. I'm not a sentimentalist about dogs. I prefer people to be cruel to animals rather than to human beings, but I couldn't help being revolted at the way he'd kicked that animal, with a hint of cold-blooded venom. Not in anger, but as if he were getting even for some trick it had played him a long while ago. That generally happened when he returned from the bridge, and it was the only sign of anything resembling emotion he showed. Otherwise, he looked a small, set, gentle creature with silver hair and a silver mustache and gold-rimmed glasses and one gold tooth like a flaw in character. Lucia hadn't been accurate when she said he'd been turned out of Guatemala and Honduras. He'd left voluntarily when the extradition proceeding seemed likely to go through, and he moved north. Mexico is still not a very centralized state, and it is possible to get round governors, as you can't get round cabinet ministers or judges. And so he waited there on the border for the next move. The earlier part of the story is, I suppose, dramatic, but I didn't watch it, and I can't invent what I haven't seen. The long waiting in anterooms, the bribes taken and refused, the growing fear of arrest, and then the flight in gold-rimmed glasses, covering his tracks as well as he could, but this wasn't finance, and he was an amateur at escape. And so he'd washed up here, under my eyes and Lucia's eyes, sitting all day under the bandstand, nothing to read but a Mexican paper, nothing to do but look across the river at the United States, quite unaware, I suppose, that everyone knew everything about him. Oh, and once a day, kicking his dog. Perhaps in its semi-setter way, it reminded him too much of the Norfolk estate though that too, I suppose, was the reason he kept it. And the next act, again, was pure comedy. I hesitate to think what this man, worth $1 million, was costing his country as they edged him out from this land and that. Perhaps somebody was getting tired of the business and careless. Anyway, they sent across 2 detectives with an old photograph. He'd grown his silvery mustache since that had been taken, and he'd aged a lot. And they couldn't catch sight of him. They hadn't been across the bridge 2 hours when everybody knew that there were 2 foreign detectives in town looking for Mr. Calloway. Everybody knew. Well, that is to say, except Mr. Calloway, who couldn't talk Spanish. There were plenty of people who could have told him in English, but they didn't. And it wasn't cruelty. It was a sort of awe and respect. Like a bull. He was on show, sitting there mournfully in the plaza with his dog, a magnificent spectacle for which we all had ringside seats. I ran into one of the policemen in the bar Antonio. He was disgusted. He had had some idea that when he crossed the bridge, life was going to be different. So much more color and sun, and I suspect love. And all he found were wide mud streets where the nocturnal rain lay in pools, and mangy dogs, smells, and cockroaches in his bedroom, and, well, the nearest to love, the open door of the Academia Comercial, where pretty girls sat all the morning learning to typewrite. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip. Perhaps they had a dream, too. Jobs on the other side of the bridge, where life was going to be so much more luxurious, refined, and amusing. We got into conversation. He seemed surprised that I knew who they both were and what they wanted. He said, "We've got information this man Calloway's in town." He's knocking around somewhere," I said. "Well, could you point him out?" "Oh, I don't know him by sight," I said. He drank his beer and thought a while. "Well, I'll go out and sit in the plaza. He's sure to pass sometime." I finished my beer and went quickly off and found Lucia. I said, "Hurry, we're going to see an arrest." We didn't care a thing about Mr. Calloway. He was just an elderly man who kicked his dog and swindled the poor, and who deserved anything he got. So we made for the plaza. We knew Calloway would be there. But it had never occurred to either of us that the detectives wouldn't recognize him. There was quite a surge of people round the place. All the fruit sellers and bootblacks in town seemed to have arrived together. We had to force our way through. And there, in the little green, stuffy center of the place, sitting on adjoining seats, were the 2 plainclothesmen and Mr. Calloway. I've never known the place so silent. Everybody was on tiptoe, and the plainclothesmen were staring at the crowd, looking for Mr. Calloway. And Mr. Calloway sat on his usual seat, staring out over the money-changing booths at the United States. "It can't go on. It just can't," Lucia said. But it did. It got more fantastic still. Stay with me. I'll be right back. It can't go on. It just can't, Lucia said. But it did. It got more fantastic still. Somebody ought to write a play about it. We sat as close as we dared. We were afraid all the time. We were going to laugh. The semi-setter scratched for fleas, and Mr. Calloway watched the USA. The two detectives watched the crowd, and the crowd watched the show with solemn satisfaction. Then one of the detectives got up and went over to Mr. Calloway. That's the end, I thought. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. For some reason, they had eliminated him from their list of suspects. I shall never know why. The man said, "You speak English?" "I am English," Mr. Calloway said. Even that didn't tear it. And the strangest thing of all was the way Mr. Calloway came alive. I don't think anybody had spoken to him like that for weeks. The Mexicans were too respectful. He was a man with $1 million. And it had never occurred to Lucia and me to treat him casually like a human being. Well, even in our eyes, he had been magnified by the colossal theft and the worldwide pursuit. He said, "This is a rather dreadful place, don't you think?" "It is," the policeman said. "I can't think what brings anybody across the bridge." "Duty," the policeman said gloomily. "I suppose you are passing through?" "Yes," Mr. Calloway said. "I'd have expected over here there'd have been, you know what I mean, a life. You read things about Mexico." "Oh, life," Mr. Calloway said. He spoke firmly and precisely, as if to a committee of shareholders. "That begins on the other side." You don't appreciate your own country until you leave it." "Oh, that's very true," Mr. Calloway said. "Very true." At first, it was difficult not to laugh. And then, after a while, there didn't seem to be much to laugh at. An old man, imagining all the fine things going on beyond the International Bridge. I think he thought of the town opposite as a combination of London and Norfolk. Theaters and cocktail bars, a little shooting, and a walk around the field at evening with the dog, that miserable imitation of a setter, poking the ditches. He'd never been across. He couldn't know that it was just the same thing over again, even the same layout, only the streets were paved and the hotels had 10 more stories and life was more expensive. And everything was a little bit cleaner. There wasn't anything Mr. Calloway would have called living. No galleries, no bookshops, just film fun and the local paper and Click and Focus and the tabloids. "Well," said Mr. Calloway, "I think I'll take a stroll before lunch. You need an appetite to swallow the food here. I generally go down and look at the bridge now. You care to come too?" The detective shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm on duty. I'm looking for a fellow." And that, of course, gave him away. As far as Mr. Calloway could understand, there was only one fellow in the world anyone was looking for. His brain had eliminated friends who were seeking friends, husbands who might be waiting for their wives, all objectives of any search but just the one. The power of elimination was what had made him a financier. He could forget the people behind the shares. That was the last we saw of him for a while. We didn't see him going into the Botica Paris to get his aspirin or walking back from the bridge with his dog. He simply disappeared. And when he disappeared, people began to talk. And the detectives heard the talk. Well, they looked silly enough. And they got busy after the very man they'd been sitting next to in the garden. And then they too disappeared. They, as well as Mr. Calloway, had gone to the state capitol to see the governor and the chief of police. And it must have been an amusing sight there, too, as they bumped into Mr. Calloway and sat with him in those waiting rooms. I suspect Mr. Calloway was generally shown in first, for everyone knew he was worth $1 million. Only in Europe is it possible for a man to be a criminal as well as a rich man. Anyway, after about a week, the whole pack of them returned by the same train. Mr. Calloway traveled Pullman, and the 2 policemen traveled in the day coach. It was evident that they hadn't got their extradition order. Lucia had left by that time. Oh, the car came and went across the bridge. I stood in Mexico and watched her get out at the United States Customs. She wasn't anything in particular, but she looked beautiful at a distance as she gave me a wave out of the United States and got back into the car. And I suddenly felt sympathy for Mr. Calloway, as if there were something over there which you couldn't find here. And turning round, I saw him back on his old beat with the dog, at his heels. I said, "Good afternoon," as if it had been all along our habit to greet each other. He looked tired and ill and dusty, and I felt sorry for him. To think of the kind of victory he'd been winning with so much expenditure of cash and care. The prize, this dirty and dreary town. The booths of the money changers, the awful little beauty parlors with their wicker chairs and sofas looking like the reception rooms of brothels. That hot and stuffy garden by the bandstand. He replied gloomily, "Good morning," and the dog started to sniff at some ordure, and he turned and kicked it with fury, with depression, with despair. And at that moment, a taxi with the 2 policemen in it passed us on its way to the bridge. Well, they must have seen that kick. Perhaps they were cleverer than I had given them credit for. Perhaps they were just sentimental about animals and thought they'd do a good deed, and the rest happened by accident. But the fact remains, those 2 pillars of the law set about the stealing of Mr. Calloway's dog. He watched them go by, and then he said, "Why don't you go across?" "Oh, it's cheaper here," I said. "Oh, I mean just for an evening. Have a meal at that place we can see at night in the sky. Go to the theater." There isn't a chance," he said angrily, sucking his gold tooth. "Well, anyway, get away from here." He stared down the hill and up the other side. He couldn't see that street climbing up from the bridge contained only the same money changers' booths as this one. I said, "Why don't you go?" He said evasively, "Oh, business." I said, "Oh, it's only a question of money. You don't have to pass by the bridge." He said with faint interest, "I don't talk Spanish." "There isn't a soul here," I said, "who doesn't talk English." He looked at me with surprise. "Is that so?" he said. "Is that so?" It's as I have said. He'd never tried to talk to anyone, and they respected him too much to talk to him. He was worth $1 million. I don't know whether I'm glad or sorry that I told him that. If I hadn't, he might be there, now, sitting by the bandstand, having his shoes cleaned, alive and suffering. 3 days later, his dog disappeared. I found him looking for it, calling it softly and shamefacedly between the palms of the garden. He looked embarrassed. He said in a low, angry voice, "I hate that dog, the beastly mongrel," and called, "Rover, Rover," in a voice which didn't carry 5 yards. He said, "I bred setters once. I'd have shot a dog like that." It reminded him I was right of Norfolk, and he lived in the memory, and he hated it for its imperfection. He was a man without a family and without friends, and his only enemy was that dog. Oh, you couldn't call the law an enemy. You have to be intimate with an enemy. Late that afternoon, someone told him they'd seen the dog walking across the bridge. It wasn't true, of course, but we didn't know that then. They'd paid a man 5 pesos to smuggle it across. So, all that afternoon and the next, Mr. Calloway sat in the garden having his shoes cleaned over and over again and thinking how a dog could just walk across like that, and a human being, an immortal soul, was bound here in the awful routine of the little walk and the unspeakable meals and the aspirin at the botica. That dog was seeing things he couldn't see, that hateful dog. It made him mad. I think literally mad. You must remember, the man had been going on for months. He had $1 million, and he was living on £2 a week, with nothing to spend his money on. He sat there and brooded on the hideous injustice of it. I think he'd have crossed over one day in any case, but the dog was the last straw. Next day, when he wasn't to be seen, I guessed he'd gone across, and I went too. The American town is as small as the Mexican. I knew I couldn't miss him if he was there, and I was still curious. A little sorry for him, but not much. I caught sight of him first in the only drugstore, having a Coca-Cola, and then once outside a cinema looking at the posters. He had dressed with extreme neatness, as if for a party. But there was no party. On my 3rd time round, I came on the detectives. They were having Coca-Colas in the drugstore, and they must have missed Mr. Calloway by inches. I went in and sat down at the bar. "Hello," I said. "You still about?" I suddenly felt anxious for Mr. Calloway. I didn't want them to meet. One of them said, "Where's Calloway?" "Oh," I said, "he's hanging on." "But not his dog," he said, and laughed. The other looked a little shocked. He didn't like anyone to talk cynically about a dog. And then they got up. They had a car outside. "Have another?" I said. "No, thanks. We've got to keep moving." The man bent close and confided to me. "Calloway's on this side." "No," I said. "And his dog?" "He's looking for it," the other said. "I'm damned if he is," I said. And again, one of them looked a little shocked, as if I'd insulted the dog. I don't think Mr. Calloway was looking for his dog, but his dog certainly found him. There was a sudden, hilarious yapping from the car, and out plunged the semi-setter, and he gamboled furiously down the street. One of the detectives, the sentimental one, was into the car before we got to the door and was off after the dog. near the bottom of the long road to the bridge was Mr. Calloway. I do believe he'd come down to look at the Mexican side when he found there was nothing but the drugstore and the cinemas and the paper shops on the American. He saw the dog coming and yelled at it to go home. Home! Home! Go home! As if they were in Norfolk. It took no notice at all, pelting toward him. And then he saw the police car coming and ran. After that, everything happened too quickly, but I think the order of events was this. The dog started across the road right in front of the car, and Mr. Calloway yelled at the dog or the car, I don't know which. Anyway, the detective swerved and he said later, weakly, at the inquiry, that he couldn't run over a dog. And down went Mr. Calloway in a mess of broken glass and gold rims and silver hair and blood. The dog was on to him before any of us could reach him, licking and whimpering and licking. I saw Mr. Calloway put up his hand, and down it went across the dog's neck, and the whimper rose to a stupid bark of triumph, but Mr. Calloway was dead. Shock and a weak heart. Poor old geezer, the detective said. I bet he really loved that dog. And it's true that the attitude in which he lay looked more like a caress than a blow. I thought it was meant to be a blow, but the detective may have been right. It all seemed to me a little too touching to be true, as the old crook lay there, with his arm over the dog's neck, dead with his $1,000,000 between the money changers' huts. But it's as well to be humble in the face of human nature. He had come across the river for something, and it may, after all, have been the dog he was looking for. Oh, it sat there, baying its stupid and mongrel triumph across his body, like a piece of sentimental statuary, the nearest he could get to the fields, the ditches, the horizon of his home. It was comic, and it was pitiable. But it wasn't less comic because the man was dead. Death doesn't change comedy to tragedy. And if that last gesture was one of affection, I suppose it was only one more indication of a human being's capacity for self-deception. Our baseless optimism that is so much more appalling than our despair. introduction information for this episode is from an article by Michelle Orange entitled Not Easy Being Green for The Nation, and other sources in our show notes. Music for this episode is Ephemer by Tony Anderson, Enigma by Jacob Lavallee, Picture Life by Emmanuel Sapphire, Desire by Valerie Roagneau, and Cornfield Chase by Michael Forster. Would you like to contact me? Do it right here in comments or at fastastleep with GinaMarie44@gmail.com or Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. I hope you'll keep us right here for you. Please, with your reviews and your likes and your comments, telling your friends, and by subscribing. I thank you all so much for listening. Keyword: million. Good night.